Okay, today my guest is Professor Jonathan Do. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Jonathan as a person, Professor Do as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Do is an AIB fellow. In addition to AIB, he is an active member of the AOM. He was elected to the Organization and Natural Environment Division Executive Committee, served as a PDW chair, program chair, division chair, elect, and past chair. He received the Grand Prize for Sustainability Issues in Business Curricula in 2014, the Richard Beckert Prize for Outstanding Paper in Change and Organization Development, the second place in the 2013 Oikos Foundation Award for Corporate Sustainability, and a gold medal from the US Department of Commerce. He is the editor-in-chief at Journal of World Business, consulting editor at Long Range Planning, co-editor-in-chief at MRN, International Environment of Global Business, and consulting editor at JIBS. Jonathan was ranked 12th most prolific international business scholar between 2001 and 2010. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy to be here with you today.
First question is, what did you want to become when you were a child?
I don't know that I had a clear and unambiguous set of aspirations, but I'm an amateur musician, and I actually think a rock musician was probably my sort of ideal. I still maintain activity in that area, but I obviously took a little bit different route.
What do you play?
I play mostly guitar and sing, but I've picked up some other instruments along the way as well. And most recently, I've discovered an app called Acapella, where you can record one instrument and then record another and record another. It's video and audio, so you can sort of be the entire band for a song, and I'm really enjoying that.
Interesting. Can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic versus international?
I can come close. And the reason is that I grew up in upstate New York, just 20 miles from the Canadian border. And the Canadian border there means the Quebec border. And while some Americans may view Canada overall as very similar to the US, Quebec is quite different. And so as a child, living in a very small town, Montreal was the big city for us. So on school trips and other kinds of outings, whether it be baseball or hockey or later on rock concerts, Montreal was sort of the mecca for where we would go to have fun and enjoy ourselves. And of course, in Quebec, French is the principal language spoken. And so it really was very much a foreign environment. But in the other direction, the Quebecois, the residents of Quebec province, would travel south to Lake Champlain. I lived along Lake Champlain in the summertime. So it was not just visiting Quebec, it was also having Quebecers visit us in the US. And so that, I think, really sparked my interest in things international, although I didn't really realize that at the time.
Jonathan, how did you choose academia?
It was a circuitous route, to say the least. I come from a family of educators. My dad was an English professor. My mom was a librarian, an elementary and middle school teacher, but it wasn't my first step. I was a trade negotiator with the US government for a number of years, which I enjoyed, but it didn't give me some of the personal sort of individual rewards that some other kinds of careers might. And I began teaching as an adjunct at Georgetown University, and I loved it so much, not so long after I quit my job with the government to take a teaching position at American University, a so-called non-tenure track teaching position, because I really enjoyed the teaching. And that then led me to a PhD, and that then led me to academia. But I was 40 years old when I finished my PhD, so I was kind of a late bloomer.
Well, you accomplished a lot, though. I mean, you accomplished a lot in a very short period of time.
I think I felt like I was a little bit behind and I had to catch up.
It's too much speed. What's something not many people would know about you that you wouldn't put on your CV?
Well, see, I've already talked about the music. That was what I was going to share with you, but I'll stick with that one. So I really enjoy music as an avocation. I don't think I was ever good enough to enjoy it as a vocation. And so it's always been a side gig, if you will, in different ways. I've performed with bands at different times. I sometimes perform solo at cafes or outdoor festivals. Never the headliner, never the lead player. But that's really something that I enjoy. I also enjoy cooking. I do most of the cooking in my family. I don't know that that's that unusual, but I find cooking very relaxing. And then I have my sports of running and skiing and some other things. But I think the music is what really moves me, and it provides a very different kind of outlet than the academic activities that occupy most of my professional time.
Interesting. Jonathan, if you stop doing what you're doing today, what would you do? I don't want to say retire, but
Yeah. So I'm going to be very honest with you. I have great respect for teachers of children of younger ages than university teachers. And I don't think I have the patience or the orientation for that. But if I did, I think being a teacher at a lower grade level, where frankly you're influencing young people at a time where perhaps you can have more impact. And again, I'm very satisfied with my interactions with my students at Villanova University. But by the time a young person is 18, 19, 20, a lot has happened. And so if I had the right skill set, I would have been a teacher of younger children, not necessarily universities. But I'm going to come back to the music. I would love to play music. And there was a time when I thought I might be a chef. My parents said to me, look, if you really enjoy cooking this much, why don't you go to culinary school? But again, I think that these are things that I enjoy as avocations, not as much as a vocation. So for me, the academic career is perfect. It's perfect because there's a lot of autonomy. There's a lot of different ways one can spend one's time. I like to say it's like being an entrepreneur without the downside risk. Maybe not the upside risk either, but not the downside risk. And I, having come to academe relatively later, I wake up every morning and I thank my lucky stars that I do what I do. I really do. I think it's just the best.
About teaching in lower grade schools, lower grades. Susan Ethy in economics, actually, she used to teach high school kids economics, and she talks very positively about the experience. I'm wondering how would that work, especially for international business, teaching high school kids, secondary school kids, IB, because we don't really do that. Man, that's actually
no. And there are others, and I can't remember. There's one gentleman, and it'll probably come to me after our conversation, who also started as a high school teacher and then went back to get his PhD. I bet that's not that unusual. So I do think that we could teach international business, or maybe more broadly, global affairs, global economics, global business and economics at the high school level. It reminds me of the story when my kids were younger. I went into their grades to try to teach them a little bit about foreign exchange. And I happened to have all these different currencies from traveling around. And I was trying to get them to think about, what one was worth in relation to another. But they were too young. I can't remember the currency. I think it might have been Fiji had a volcano on it. And one of the kids said, have you ever seen a volcano go off? And they all started jumping around and pretending to be volcanoes. And needless to say, we didn't really get back into the foreign exchange discussion. So they were maybe a little too young. But no, I think we could bring more of this into high school, into secondary school for sure.
Regrets? Have you got any regrets?
Not really. I did start late in academe. And so, I could have a regret. Gosh, I wish I got it started sooner. But I think I appreciate it more because I did come to it later. I think if I'd gone right through undergraduate, graduate, PhD, I'm not sure I would really fully appreciate the qualities that we have as academics in comparison to some other jobs. And in particular, not just the flexibility and the autonomy, but also the opportunity to interact with students. I got into it for teaching. I did not get into it for scholarship. That came later. I decided I wanted to be an academic because I enjoyed the teaching experience, being in that classroom with students and interacting with them and engaging with them. That's what really got me excited about the career.
Jonathan, can I ask you something about this trade negotiator days of yours?
Yes.
How did it help? Or did it help at all?
It helped a lot. And the fact that I am interested and have maintained interest in the intersection of international business, of international political economy, governmental policy, and then later NGOs emanated directly from my experience in the government. Because I came in as the NAFTA agreement itself was being concluded, but then there was a change of administration. And Bill Clinton came in and he said, well, NAFTA is all fine and well, but we need to do something about labor and the environment. And so there was a subsequent negotiation that resulted in the supplemental agreements on labor and the environment. And at the time, I was a real pro-free trader. I was one of those who was wondering, why do we need these supplemental agreements? Trade is good, period, full stop. But I came to appreciate that there really is a logic to attending to social and environmental issues alongside trade and international business. And that's frankly been really one way or another, the core of what I've been thinking about and teaching and researching ever since 25 years.
About what are you most proud of? What are you most passionate about?
I don't know that I could think of any one thing. I think the integration and introduction of the social sector generally and the non-governmental sector in particular in international business is something I'm proud of. When I, along with a couple others, Hildy Teegen and Sushil Vachani and some others, first proposed this notion, there was a lot of pushback. A lot of our colleagues said NGOs have no business in international business discussions. It's international business with a capital B. And we pushed and we cajoled and we, elbowed. And now I don't think anybody denies that international business, broadly defined, incorporates the social sector. And so that's something I'm quite proud of. I'm also proud of the fact that I have contributed scholarship, basic scholarship, empirical scholarship, cases and teaching materials. I personally think it's very important that we connect our research to practice and teaching. And so being able to make some kind of contributions across those different platforms is also important to me.
Jonathan, I asked this question to figure out what people tell, how they summarize their research. I mean, you've been doing it, but to people who don't read your work regularly, say you're stranded in a small village, in a small pub, how do you explain what you do to people who don't read academic research? And why is that important?
Yeah, I might say something like, I'm interested in the role and responsibility of business in an international setting, especially the way that business interacts with non-business organizations. And I would give some examples like Amnesty International or Conservation International or World Wildlife Federation or these kinds of organizations. And I think most people could follow along with that. I think that's fairly intuitive. And
what are understudied, underutilized, or neglected areas in IB research?
There's one that's not as neglected as it once was. And it's not an area of specialization of mine, by the way, and that's migration in all of its forms. I think for the last 4 or 5 years, we now do have a subset of IB scholars who are interested in migration. I think those who studied diaspora communities were probably the first out of the gate. But it's a global phenomenon, and we tend to think about trade in goods and trade in services, but we don't always think about the movement of people. In a narrow sense, we've thought about it historically, like with expatriate management and whatnot. But we have groups of people not just moving around, but working remotely in other countries for other employers. And so I think that's something we need to think more about. And one of the reasons we perhaps have not is that we tend not to think on a real, true global scale in international business. In other words, we tend to be focused on the firm as the level of analysis, as the organization of activity. But I think we need to be more comfortable moving up and down levels. And there's no reason we can't study a particular migrant community, a group of people or a loosely, organized coalition, and then make some generalizations about migration more broadly, just as we do in other areas. So I don't see any reason why it's off the table. It appeals to me because it does deal with, social as well as economic and business issues. So that's one that I think continues to deserve even more attention.
I want to talk about creativity. How does creativity happen? What does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of idle curiosity? Where do these ideas come from?
I think they come from a lot of places. I do a little bit of executive education teaching, and that is one of the places that I come up with new ideas. A lot of the clients, the groups that are participating in that executive education are non-US, many of them Chinese and East Asian. And so I get some interesting ideas from interacting with those folks, because I wouldn't otherwise have firsthand interactions with executives from those parts of the world. But sometimes just, thinking in the shower in the morning, or riding my bicycle, or taking a run, I am somebody who gets bored easily. And so I'm always on the quest for new ideas. And sometimes, to be honest with you, I don't always follow through as well as I could. And that's where collaborators come in, because I don't have the bandwidth to do it all, to have the idea, to write up the study, to do the empirics, to gather the data. And so I like to think of myself as somebody that has pretty good ideas. I think I'm a pretty good writer. I'm an okay methodologist, but I can't do it all. And when I first came out of my PhD, I tried to. I had one big success, and I made the rookie error of generalizing from an N of 1. And I learned my lesson, and it took me a couple of years. And now there's nothing I love more than being part of a team. I really love teams, and I learned so much from teams, not just author collaborations, but as an editor, as a journal editor. And a quick update on your bio. So I moved from Journal of World Business a couple of years ago to Journal of Management Studies. I'm a general editor of Journal of Management Studies. And again, we are working in these editorial roles in global virtual teams. And it really is exactly that. It's a global virtual team. And I learned so much from those teams.
Jonathan, a question about the next 5 to 10 years of the field. What are some of the big questions in the field?
I think I'm gonna keep returning to. I'm sort of singing off the same song sheet I was singing from earlier, and I really did think that is the social and environmental dimensions of business. I think now it's become so front and center for at least most developed countries and many developing countries. Think about climate change, that up until recently, we had a group of businesses that were out in front of our government when it came to making serious commitments, the whole net zero movement. And so I do think business has the potential to be a leader, not just a follower, in the social and environmental grand challenges of the day. So I think that IB needs to continue to back out of our sometimes narrow gaze on very particular measures of, say, performance, and think more holistically about the role and responsibility of business and how business can be an agent of positive change. So that's not new, but I think it's even more salient now than it was just 5 years ago.
When you're doing executive ed teaching to, what did you say, Asian students?
Yes.
Are they approaching the social dimension the same way that American students or the Western students are?
I think they're approaching it a little bit differently. I think and I don't want to generalize too much here, but at least in some Asian countries, there's more of a kind of a paternalistic role for business as the custodian or steward of employees, of other stakeholders. And it's a little bit more like a family almost, or a patriarchal leadership in a very positive sense. So I do think that CSR, social responsibility, sustainability, does manifest differently in different cultures, no question. It's there, but it emanates and manifests in a different way. Also,
I started doing a little poll among the interviewees. Nationalism versus globalization. What is the next phase? Are we going to see more globalization or increase in nationalism?
Boy, that's a question of the day, isn't it? I think I would slightly dodge the question and say that for the time being, we are seeing more regionalism, and that may not be necessarily a bad thing. My boss back in the 90s in the Commerce Department used to say that as we push further ahead in globalization and global integration, and as globalization affects more sort of everyday parts of life, especially like in services, when we start to have, engineers or lawyers or doctors, coming in and out of countries, it does start to make people uncomfortable. And we need to have some other, policies to help make them more comfortable. And I don't think, at least in the US context, we've always had those policies. So I think we're on a pause. I think we're definitely on a pause. And the question is, are we going to further retrench internationalism? I don't think so. I would like to think that we've sort of gone about as far as we're going to. But I think in COVID, in some ways, doesn't help. I think COVID in some ways has brought out some of the worst of us in terms of, hoarding vaccines and just looking after our own. And it's a real, I think it's a real shame because developing countries, I think, are getting the raw end of the deal. So I think we're in a pause, and I don't know that we will return to a rapid ascent, if you will, towards globalization, but nor do I think we will continue to retrench into these, national fiefdoms either. So I take an intermediate position on the question, I guess, is what I would say.
Very polished. This was very good. Okay. Well, you've been an editor for a very long time. You can say something about the evolution of the field, what it was like, what is going to be like. Where are we going?
So again, I have my particular take on things. One of the things that I have appreciated in recent years is I feel like we are getting better at addressing contemporary issues as they unfold, as opposed to looking in the rearview mirror and explaining things that are 5 or 8 or 10 or 12 years old. And I think that was a legitimate criticism of not just our field, but others. I think it was especially salient for our field because things in international business change quickly. And if we can't change along with them, then we're always a step behind. And so what Alan Rugman has done at JIBS, what I try to do at the Journal of World Business, to provide more opportunities for rapid, responsive contributions that may not fit the traditional empirical article of an introduction, theory, lit review, hypotheses, but still have something important to say about IB in relation to the contemporary world. And in that regard, I also very much welcome the introduction of the Journal of International Business Policy. Mm-hmm. I think that was a really important step for the Academy of International Business to take in the international business community more broadly, again, particularly because I'm interested in those issues. So I'm reasonably happy with the way things are going, even though, Peter Buckley and Mirko Minishki and I wrote a couple of years ago that we thought maybe IB was sort of missing some opportunities. Of course, we were looking backwards at that time as well. And now when I look back 3 or 4 years since we wrote that article, I see some real positive changes and mostly around willingness to address contemporary issues as they unfold.
Which IB question is overly studied? And I think it's time to leave it a bit.
Well, I'm going to give you the cliche answer, and that is the relationship between internationalization and performance. Many others have said that that's overstudied, and I would agree with them. And I actually think now people are just not doing that anymore. I think they're saying, is it an S, is it an inverted U, whatever it is? It depends, right? It depends. I think we've concluded we don't have one answer. And in some ways, that was healthy to have all those different answers because it reminds us in other situations, context matters. And supposedly that's what's one of our differentiating factors in IB is that we explicitly acknowledge context. If so, then we need to be careful about generalizing beyond the context that we're studying. And I think that was some of the danger of some of those internationalization performance studies.
About advice and mentoring, who was your advisor?
My advisor was Hildy Teegen. And interestingly, she was 5 years younger than me when she was my PhD advisor. I don't think you're going to find many in your interview series that would have that experience. And
what was the best advice you received from her?
So she had not supervised many PhD students. I think I was the first through the gate with her. And I think she would agree that we had more of a collaboration. She certainly knew the academic world more than I did, but it was a very collaborative relationship. And so it wasn't so much the traditional, mentor-mentee. And I kind of reject that mentor-mentee idea a little bit. I think we have a lot to learn from our PhD students as they have a lot to learn from us. So I try to be careful not to be always advising younger people about this direction or that direction, or assuming that my experiences are necessarily relevant and applicable to them. To me, the best advice is really to follow your passion, but to be practical. I think one of the challenges that PhD students face is they do feel pressure to publish, to get ahead, to make tenure, and those are real pressures. Those are realities. but I encourage them, don't lose your passion for it. And the reason I got into this was teaching, as I said earlier. So even though I think some of us, we're incentivized to try to kind of work our way out of teaching, I try to remind myself, no, wait a minute, that's the whole reason you got into this to begin with. If you lose that, you lose everything. You lose everything.
What do you wish you would have known when you were starting out? I mean, you started late, okay. And then you started with the teaching track and then switched to research. What are some of the things that you realized? What are some things you realized later on that you said, if I knew this, it would save me 5 years, 10 years, 2 papers, 2 A+, something.
The collaboration, I'll come back to that. As I said, I made the rookie error of thinking that because I had a single authored article out of my dissertation, sort of top tier, top level, I thought, oh, I can do this by myself. I don't need help. And I started sending things out and they were getting rejected. And I finally came to the obvious conclusion that there's just so much power in collaboration. And it's not just about the product, it's about the relationships that you develop as well. Academia, I think, can be a somewhat lonely and isolating career, depending on how you organize yourself and spend your time. And so to have those collaborative relationships, those friendships that last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, a career, boy, that's extremely important. And it's so rewarding when you go to a conference or now at Zoom and you see a colleague that you haven't seen for a while and you have a chance to catch up. That's really important. But anyway, the notion that you're going it alone, and by the way, this is something that I would mention to a PhD student. I think some PhD students believe that they have a really great idea, and if they start to share it with others, others are going to steal it. They're going to appropriate it. They're going to pick it off. And I hate to break it to them that, like, your ideas may be good, but there's a lot of great ideas out there too. Don't just assume that what you're sitting on is this super special sauce. And reverse the way of thinking about it. Think about how others can help you improve that idea. If somebody else happens to have a similar idea, don't assume that they took it from you. They may have come to it on their own, but why not get together? Why not get together? Just like the pharmaceutical companies get together when they have one way of battling a disease and another way of battling disease, but they put it together and it's all the more powerful. So I do think there's just enormous power and rewards in collaboration. I really believe that.
What you just said is very powerful. Yes, true. People can come to the same conclusion, same idea, separately, unrelated from each other. And yet, once the paper is out, then you have to go back to the drawing board again. So I can see why the PhD student or the junior faculty wants to be secretive about it. But
I can understand it, but I don't think it's a healthy. I don't think it's practical, because figuring out who might borrow your idea ex ante is almost impossible. You just don't know. So I would say just assume the best. Assume the best. And if something happens, well, you took a risk. But I think better to assume the best and then derive opportunities out of that than hold things close like I did, perhaps, and not allow that to bear fruit. And again, that's something you just learn over time. And at least that's what I have learned. Others might come to a different conclusion.
That was very positive. I mean, I would like to end on that positive note. What is one last question? What is one question I should have asked you but haven't?
Maybe how you balance work and life, and how you manage that. My wife works full time. I think, again, we're lucky in academia because we have more flexibility. So my work hours, I tend to start really early because my kids get up early. I tend to knock off around 2 or 3 to spend time with them, pick them, depending on their ages, pick them up from school, and then come back to it in the evening. And that's nice to be able to do that, to just interrupt, your day for those kinds of things. It's sometimes tough though, because with academia, there's no sharp division between work and life. And so that can create a little bit of discord or confusion among others who, when they are off work, they're off work. And when they're on, they're on. But I think we've been able to work it out in my family reasonably well, I think, if you were to ask them. But it's something, I think, especially with more women in the workforce and sensitivities around the role of women in society, something that we need to be more attuned to. COVID has pointed up the fact that things still are not as equal as they might be in terms of who bears the burden when the kids are at home Zooming all day, whatever. So I think work-life balance is something we all need to think about, not just for ourselves, but as we consider our interactions with others as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me.
This was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And I congratulate you for the series, and I wish you the best with your other interviews.
Thank you. Thanks.
Take care.